You're listening to the winning literary show, Off the Shelf Books Talk Radio, live with host Denise Turney, author of the books Long Walk Up, Portia, Love Pour Over Me, Spiral, Love Has Many Faces, and Rosetta's Great Hope. Turn up your dial and get ready for a blast of feature author interviews, 411 on book festivals, writing conferences, and so much more. Ready? Let's go.
Good morning out there, and I'm in prayer that this show goes well. My landline phone, I just went to reach for it, it's gone, and my cell phone does not always have good reception, so I'm going to ask my guests to be patient, and I'm going to ask myself to be patient. So I'm going to start with this quote from Brad Sugars, and it's words can inspire, thoughts can provoke, but only action truly brings you closer to your dreams, and I so agree with that. Words can inspire, thoughts can provoke, but only action truly brings you closer to your dreams, and that's from Brad Sugars. And I want to welcome you. This is the Mother's Day weekend to our Saturday, May 13th show. Thank you for being here with us this morning. And before we introduce you to today's awesome guest, and I'm excited to talk to our guests and hoping my cell phone works right, I just want to ask you, how good of a mystery sleuth are you? Do you like to figure things out before it's revealed in the movie? I was watching a good mystery last night, and the ending was kind of surprising, which I do like with a mystery. And how much do you value relationships? If you value relationships and you love a good mystery, I encourage you to get a copy of Love Pour Over Me. You can get it in ebook or print book copy, and it's by yours truly, Denise Turney. If you don't see it on the shelves, just ask the clerk to get you a copy of Love Pour Over Me by Denise Turney. There is a wonderful romantic relationship. These two people are meant to be together. Then there are these 5 friends who Raymond Clark, he's on his way to the Olympics. He's a track and field standout. He meets them when he goes to college at Pennsylvania. That's also where he meets the love of his life. But he is a witness to a murder, too, and is one of his friends involved. If you love a love story, friendships, and a mystery, I think you'll really enjoy Love Pour Over Me. And now let us go and meet our very special off-the-shelf guest. And this morning's guest is Max Friedman. Max worked for 5 years at WNET, PBS, as a publicist for Bill Moyers Journal and other programs. Then he was responsible for editorial projects at WNET. He also worked as head of communication at Bristol Myers Squibb. I used to work across the street from them in Princeton. And he's also worked as a speechwriter and freelancer. He authored 2 memoirs, one of Charles A. Heimbold, Jr., a retired pharmaceutical company CEO, and that's A Life Lived Full. And the other of his wife, Monika Heimbold, that's Charles Heimbold's wife, a retired clinical social worker and a co-founder with Queen Silvia of Sweden of the World Childhood Foundation. And the foundation focuses on child trafficking and exploitation, and the title of that book is Designing a Life. Now, Painful Joy Off the Shelf, listeners, is Max Friedman's newest book, and it's based in part on his parents. They were Polish Holocaust survivors who lost everyone in their families during this horrific, awful, awful war. They survived the camps and then met and married in Sweden. And Max writing, if you go over to his website, his writing is, or we're going to ask him if he does have a website. With my research, I don't think I came across one. But his writing is very engaging and impactful. He is a husband, a father, and a grandfather. We're absolutely honored to have Max with us here on Off the Shelf this morning. Welcome, Max.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. I just, my cell phone is tricky sometimes, and I went to pick up my landline to dial into the show, and it was gone. So I got to get a new landline phone today.
Okay.
But I'm going to keep pushing forward. I've learned 17 years off the shelf, just keep moving forward. So, but I want to welcome you and thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
The first few questions I ask every single guest who comes on the show to give the listeners a little backstory on the guest before I start talking about their books. So to kick it off this morning, Max, can you tell off-the-shelf listeners where you grew up and what life was like for you growing up.
Sure. I was born in Sweden, as was my older sister. We came to the United States in 1952, and we grew up in Coney Island, which is at the southern tip of Brooklyn. It's where amusement parks are. People go to the beach there. And that's where we lived until I was in sixth grade. It was a very difficult life. We were very poor. And my parents, as we'll talk about, were Holocaust survivors. And they were still suffering great traumas after the war and actually the entire lives. And so life for us, while we were living near an amusement park, near the beach, we didn't go on any rides, and we spent a good part of our lives as young kids taking care of our parents instead of the other way around. That's the short answer.
Oh. Good thing you had siblings. You know, going through hardships, they say it's better going with a sibling than if you're an only child.
Sister was, exactly. My sister is wonderful. She's a few years older than me. And it was the two of us trying to take care of our parents against the world.
Now, when you were a little boy, what did you dream of becoming when you grew up? What did you want to be when you grew up when you were a kid?
I wanted to be Superboy when I grew up.
Oh.
I wanted to be some magical figure who could, I hate to say it, escape from the life I had. When I was a very young child, 8 years old, I would actually, when my father was asleep on Saturdays, my mother and my sister would go looking for things they couldn't afford in downtown Brooklyn, clothes. I would actually take the subway to the city in Manhattan, and I would ride up and down in elevators. I would get dressed up with a little bow tie, and I'd make believe I was an adult, becoming part of an adult world, going to work. I carried a manila envelope because we didn't have a briefcase and I didn't have one. But it was this great make-believe of what I could become when I was grown up and away from where I lived and the life we had.
It's amazing, our imaginations when we're kids, and we don't limit ourselves.
Yeah.
We say, well, like you said, if I don't have a briefcase, I'm going to get something that makes it seem like I have one. Then we get older and we just pump the brakes and we stop ourselves. Now, you said, how old were you again when your family came to the United States?
I was just 2 years old.
You were super young.
Yeah, we were, we were living in Sweden. My parents, after their liberation from the concentration camps, were taken by the Swedish Red Cross to Sweden to recuperate. They had terrible malnutrition, had been beaten for many years. My mother had typhus. And so they were there in other camps called alien camps, and they met, and shortly after they met, pretty much 6 months after they met, they married, and my sister came after that, and then I came a few years later. They tried to come to the United States for about 7 years, and they couldn't. In the early part of their marriage and of our living there, America wouldn't take any survivors from the camps. It was a horrible time for America as well. So they couldn't come even if they wanted to. Then eventually they did. My father had a cousin who had come to the cousins who had come to the United States back in the 1920s. And so they sponsored us, and we lived with them for a while, and then we lived by ourselves in Coney Island.
Oh, my goodness. Everybody has, you meet people on the street, you pass people, you don't even think, sometimes becoming curious, well, wonder what their story is, wonder what their life experience is, instead of making assumptions, or we just don't even get to know each other. We just pass each other.
Right.
Who or what inspired you? No, go ahead.
No. I actually that's actually the point of the book is to introduce people to my parents and to the life they had, the life they might have had, so that they and all the other people who suffered and mostly who were murdered during the Holocaust aren't just numbers, just a statistic, but actually are human beings, could have been your neighbor, somebody's neighbor, and I wanted to introduce them not just as survivors or as anonymous statistics, but as human beings.
Who or what inspired you to actually pursue writing? Who birthed your love for books?
Writing, well, I think both my sister and I were avid readers when we were young. We got our library cards and we were off to the races. It was, again, a way to escape from reality. And we spent, and one of the best times I remember was having read all the books I wanted to read in the children's section of the Brooklyn Public Library branch near where we live. I got an adult card, and that was a joyous day. And suddenly there were all these other books and all these other worlds that I could explore. So, I think that started us, both of us, and we continued. And over time, I just found that I wanted to be all kinds of other things. I wanted to be a chemist. I wanted to be a pianist. I wanted to be an orchestra conductor. I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be all those things. The only thing that I could do really well, I certainly couldn't do math well. I wasn't very good in science. Was to write. And so in junior high school, I became the editor of a junior high school newspaper. Then in high school, became the editor of the high school newspaper. And that got me started on the idea that this is what I could do best, and this is what I'd like to do.
Okay, now before we start talking about Painful Joy, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your other experiences that you had. I know you, doing my research for the interview, discovered you dreamed of writing stories about Japan earlier in your career. Did you make it to Japan and write for magazines and newspapers there? And if so, what was that experience like?
No, I made it to Japan eventually, but many, many years later. In college, I actually was an Asian studies and English major. Asian studies didn't work out because Japanese was way too hard for me. I just couldn't do it. And so I studied the culture and the literature, but I couldn't actually become a major because I couldn't speak the language or read in the language. So Japan was far away, and I wrote about Japan, but only because I was working at Bristol Myers at the time, and I was doing a piece about the healthcare system in Japan and what life was like there mostly for patients and for doctors, since Bristol was a pharmaceutical company that was selling and developing anti-cancer drugs.
Okay, now after you and your wife Jennifer started your family, you did pursue journalism. I wanted to ask you, because journalism has changed so much over the years, did being a journalist live up to your expectations?
Well, no, or sometimes. I started to do both freelance writing, and I got a job I went to journalism school actually at Berkeley, and got a master's in it, and that's where I tipped my feet into actually doing reporting, and I liked some of it. Then when I went to work on a newspaper in New Jersey, my first real journalism job, again I liked it, but at that point we decided we were going to have a family, and And journalism is the kind of thing where you really have to devote your life to if you're going to be good at it. You have to go up the sort of ladder of what journalists do. So first you go to a small newspaper, then you go to a larger daily paper, then you work the night shift, the midnight to 6 shift, and you do all these other things. And frankly, with a family, that was not what I wanted to do. I think my experience as a child and the family that I was with and living in and got me to sort of understand the importance of family in a preeminent way. My father had lost his wife, his first wife, and his two little girls. They were killed, and he devoted his life to family, and he was my role model for that, and he would do everything and anything. He worked 6 days a week. He didn't make much money, but family was everything to him. And so I decided I would continue doing freelance writing, and I had a good time with that. One day I interviewed Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and it was a lovely and very special experience. I went to Liechtenstein and sat with the prince and princess of Liechtenstein in their castle. So, wonderful experiences. When I worked for Bill Moyers, we went to the White House, and he interviewed President Carter at the time. And I was in the control room downstairs, and then went in and sat in the Oval Office and called my wife from there and said, "Guess where I am?" Then I went into the cabinet room, sat down there, and called her again and said, "Guess where I am?" And wow. The president kept looking at me as though I was where's Waldo, because I kept popping up before the interview wherever he was, and it was an extraordinary experience too. So I had wonderful experiences, but I decided I couldn't devote my life to journalism. I had to devote it, and I wanted to devote it to my family and what I could do with that in terms of writing and reporting and interviewing people and learning about their stories, I could do in other ways.
Now, how did you, for our listeners here at Off the Shelf who might be interested in going into journalism or working on television or radio, can you tell us how you did land that job at WNET, and what was it like working there?
Yeah, WNET was wonderful. Public television at that time was going through the usual crisis of fundraising and everything else, but it had a stellar group of people. I worked for Bill Moyers. I worked for Dick Cavett. I worked for a while for the McNeil-Air Report, and so it was a very creative place. It was a very sort of free and open place where you could meet just the most extraordinary people doing extraordinary things in an environment where they're doing it not for money. They're doing it because they believe in what they're doing, and they believe in journalism and in reporting the world as it is, as well as a world that we might want to create for ourselves. So how I got the job, I think I answered an ad in a newspaper, and it was fairly simple. and I interviewed, and they liked me, and they liked the fact that I had been freelancing, and I'd been doing actually television criticism for, I don't know if you remember, but there was a publication called The Village Voice.
Yes. Okay.
And I was freelancing television criticisms for them, so I knew something. I had met other TV critics, so I knew a bit about the business of television too. So it was lovely. Yeah.
Oh my God! It just seemed like just to hear you talk. It seems like you went from one thing, one door opened after the next, I'm sure it was not that easy. But now everything's on the internet. It just wow.
I was very lucky. I think I counted once. I had 9 different jobs in actually the first 4 years that I went out to work. And it wasn't that, and the economy was terrible, but I didn't really. I mean, my wife and I, Jennifer, we lived modestly, and I was just looking for a place where I could enjoy working and writing, and so I would explore. I worked I did jacket copy for Macmillan Publishing. I mean, I did all kinds of stuff. It was always with writing, communicating, and finally when I landed at public television, and then I did a stint actually at a large PR firm, and I did mostly just the writing there, and then finally at Bristol Myers, where I was for 20 years, and then went out on my own for another 15 years. It was a joy. It was always something that's difficult when you first do it. Even doing these interviews now on podcasts, you're nervous the first 5 seconds of it. You know, you just anticipate a lot, and then once it starts, it's like it has been going on for a long time, and that's true of writing too. Once you get your first paragraph down, the rest flows.
Now, you were also, as you said, a publicist for Bill Moyers Journal, and you enjoyed that.
Right.
I have to ask you this, and again, I'm asking for our listeners who might want to do this type of work themselves. Was that a big stretch? Your writing covers a broad range. Was that a big stretch? I know you just said once you get the first few words down.
No, I think if you're interested in the world, and Bill Moyers had amazing guests or people that he would profile and interview. So you write about that, and you're learning as you're going along, which is also a great experience. You're learning about the people, which is really fantastic. And that was also true when I worked at Bristol, where I talked to hundreds of patients and dozens and dozens of scientists and wrote about their stories. And the patients, some of them had miraculous cures, some of them were not going to be cured. That young children that I would talk to actually, who had great dreams, and they themselves knew that it wasn't going to happen. They had diseases that where drugs could help them only for a short time, and so you get a feel for the spirit, the human spirit, in a way that you wouldn't expect to when you're working for a large company, or even for Bill. I mean, it's Bill's story; it's not my story. But these others, just writing those stories and getting a real sense of human suffering and human triumphs, again, prepared me, I think, for then finally delving into my own story and my parents' story.
Okay, one more question before we go into painful joy.
Okay, sure.
This to you, I think this sounds normal to you. You going from from freelancing to WNET to you're there when the president's being interviewed, to Bristol Myers Squibb, publicist work, corporate writing. You just it seems fluid. This shift for you seems fluid, almost like maybe I asked a question, you're like, why? The question is maybe confusing to you. It seems natural to you to do it. But I wanted to ask you, how do you stay open? Because for a lot of us, it can be a struggle when one door closes to even see the opportunity to go another way. Some people, it's not as easy. How do you stay open, successfully moving from one discipline to another?
I think that is one of the great lessons of a very difficult upbringing, and the lessons that my parents taught me, each in a very different way, to never give up. And so you live in the moment, and this is how my father, I know, survived. He lived only in the moment. He never looked at the past, and he actually never looked at the future, because the future for him was to be killed, to be starved to death. The past was losing everybody he ever loved. So the present was important to him. And the lesson I learned from my parents, who survived in a different way because they were very different kinds of people, was that you just never give up. You don't. The world has defeated you. You don't allow yourself to be defeated, because I saw what defeat looked like. I saw what giving up looked like, and they taught us that all too well. So to this day, there are a lot of issues and challenges in our lives. Where I'm getting older, much older, and you just you beat the challenge and you say, oh, this isn't great. I don't want this to happen. But at the end of the day, it's happening. And I studied Buddhism for a long time, and the thing I learned there was something called patient acceptance, which is basically that when you can't control something, you accept it, and you accept it not in an angry way. You accept it in a modest way and say, all right, this gives me an opportunity. This is not about I've been defeated, but I just have to find another way to succeed.
Wow. I'm telling you, you inspired me. Yes, just to see your own life. I know your parents. It's amazing how you just keep going from one door. Because sometimes a lot of us, we can't get. Can you now give us, Max, an overview of your book, Painful Joy? Sure.
Okay. First, I should say, because you asked about my website, I do have a website, which is maxfriedman.net. Because on there, actually, you can learn more about Painful Joy, but also about sort of the world in which I had lived, and it's sort of it is a supplement in some ways to Painful Joy. Painful Joy, again, as you said, took me about 5 years to research and write. I had avoided my parents' story in many different ways. First, because surviving their survival seemed to me sufficient. Second, because their world was so painful to them, and the traumas and the memories that they had. My sister and I really did never ask them about their lives. I asked my father once, and he told me about only one thing that happened in his life, which was his story for the last time he saw his wife and children. And that was a 20-minute story when I was 20 years old. Otherwise, I didn't know anything about it. And I knew that asking him clearly would be painful to him. And we saw them suffer enough, and they had suffered enough before we met them. So this was not for my sister or for me to do. So we didn't. And so by the time I decided to do Painful, to find out who they were, where I came from, why I became what I became to some degree, and by that time they were gone. And so there was no one to ask. And most of the records, frankly, were destroyed during the Holocaust. The Germans, most of the records of Jews in most of the places where the Germans went were kept in synagogues. The records of their births, civil society and Jewish society often were not the same thing in many of these countries, especially for poor people. And so that was all destroyed because the synagogues were all burnt and destroyed. So it was very hard to begin to find out about them, and that's why it took a very long time, and I was lucky in meeting some people who helped me along the way. And my wife and I actually went to Sweden, went to Poland, went to Germany, went to Israel to find out more from various archives that we had identified. So it was a long journey to find out, and it was an important journey. First, I thought just for the families that I had, my kids, who knew my parents, but their children who didn't, my grandchildren. My sister had 4 boys. Three of them knew my mother and father, but they had families and their kids didn't know anything. And so it was very important. And then as I wrote the story and as I showed it to just a few people, they told me that this was more or less a universal story that needed to be told, not only because the Holocaust was being forgotten and the survivors were all dying or dead just from old age or illness, but it was our responsibility to tell the world still to transform them into human beings. When people went into concentration camps, and those who even survived into slave labor camps, they were given numbers. Their names were taken away. They were not treated as humans. They were dehumanized. And the process of dehumanizing people is, I think, the core of all genocides. And it's the core of many of our political and divisions. It's in racism and anti-Semitism. These are all, they come in large measure from looking at people as the other, and not only as the other, but as the enemy. And the only way you can deal with an enemy in some cases, and even these days in our political discussions, is to kill your enemy. They become so hateful to you. And that's the core of, and that's what the Nazis did. They made the Jews and the Romans, the Gypsies, the mentally ill, gay people, anyone who was not blue-eyed and blonde and had pure blood, as racially inferior, studied racism as though it were a science, as opposed to a hateful ideology. So all of that, particularly these days, needs to be discussed and put in context. And so my hope was to take these two strangers that they start out as people you don't know at all, or maybe don't care about, and by the end of the journey, you get to care about them. You get to feel empathy for them. You get to, and if you can feel empathy for strangers in a book, 2 characters in a book that happen just to be real characters, not made up, then that could spread to other parts of your life, and should.
Oh my God! Well, thank you for writing it. I think it is something that so much in different when we just treat each other so poorly. Then there's this urgency to hide the wrongs we've done, like just get it out of the books. We're not going to put it in film. Don't talk about it.
It's horrible. My wife is a librarian, and I mean it's terrible what's going on with books. In school, it's horrible.
Yeah. Sorry. We do the wrong, and then it's like, okay, now let's all just forget about it and act like it never happened. And
right.
That is just so unfortunate. So thank you for writing Painful Joy. Now you said you and your siblings, your sister, never asked your parents like what happened to them. You never brought it up. They never, ever, ever. So you're coming up with this idea to write this book, their stories. They're no longer here. They never spoke anything about it, because I could only imagine how hard to research for this book must have been.
Yeah. Well, two things. First, my father, in fact, never spoke about it. He never spoke about his past at all. My mother only spoke about her past within two contexts. One, she talked about, and that's why we turned out how we ever turned out. She talked about concentration camps. She never talked about who she was before. She had one story which she told us again and again, which actually turned out not to be true, which I can tell you about later. But otherwise, she would just talk to us about her time in the concentration camps, about all the terrible things that she saw, all the people that were murdered, people who were shot while she was standing in the middle of all this. So this was our, I mean, I hate to say it, but this was our bedtime stories. This is what she told us. And this is all we knew. So we didn't, it was enough, believe me. It was more than enough. And then, interestingly, so I stayed away. I stayed away from the subject of the Holocaust. I stayed away from them and their lives because clearly whatever I knew was for my mother too much. And she would have told us other things, I assumed, if she wanted to, because she was a talker. So so that's what it was. So it was very hard. It was hard to begin. I didn't know where to begin, and I happened to have a friend who I had coffee with, and I told him that I was thinking about doing this book, or at least learning something, and then see where it would go. And he told me that he actually had met somebody at a high school reunion just very recently, and that guy's son had a Holocaust studies that ran or worked in a Holocaust study center in Munich. He wasn't Jewish; he was actually Austrian. And the history that he was looking into was the Holocaust, and wanting to keep that Holocaust story alive in Germany, actually. And Germany's actually done a very good job compared to most other countries, including the U.S., in doing that, ironically. But in any case, so I sent the guy an email. His name is Giles, and he over time we got to talk, and he sent me a list of 100 or 200 things that I should look into. And it was all terribly overwhelming, and I started doing what I could. And every once in a while I would get in touch with him and say, I learned this. Is there somebody else I could talk to? So the actual Holocaust part of their story, I was able to piece together fairly well by talking to experts who are expert in specific aspects of the Holocaust. For instance, my father was on a death march near the end of the war, and I spoke to a person who knew everything there was to know about death marches, and she told me about the death march that he was likely on. So all of that, it became learning many, many things that were disparate and unconnected, and letting my brain start putting it together when I was asleep or otherwise, to unravel and then piece together again their story, and then actually go to a lot of these places to try to find out more, or to just immerse yourself in the geography of my mother's, where my mother lived, for example. So where she lived had become the central, where she lived for 25 years in Poland, in Krakow, had become the central theme, and was used, the building in which she lived was used in Schindler's List as the setting for the Krakow Ghetto. So it had become a tourist attraction, and the and I only found this out because we were going to go to Poland, and so I was trying to find every place, every address that my parents had from the time that they were born. And I had found a lot. And when I got to my mother and where she lived in Krakow, I put in her address, just a street name and number, Josepha 12. And suddenly Google sends me over to Steven Spielberg and Schindler's List, and then shows me the building that she lived in, and then shows me the pictures from the film where it is being all recreated in that building. So we went there and actually watched a tour guide give a tour, and it was the first time I ever actually walked over to anybody in my adult life, and this was in 2018, and actually said something about my parents and the Holocaust in a very direct way. And I interrupted this woman who was telling the story of, I guess, Schindler's List at the time, which was a story that was very close to what my mother's story was. And I said, "Excuse me, but my mother lived here, and all the family lived here, and they were all killed here." And then I couldn't talk anymore because I choked up. But it was the first time I ever did that. And then it became easier to do it. And I now, as I'm talking about painful joy, I do it a lot. And I still get choked up every once in a while.
Oh, my God. I can't even imagine. It's just certain things that have happened in history, humans, that we do to each other. I can't even imagine it. Can't even imagine it. Now, in Painful Joy, when the book opens, do you tell your parents' stories from their youth up? And if not, what time period is it when the book begins?
Yeah, well, the book tries to find out everything. Painful Joy tries very hard to piece together their lives from the moment that they were born. They were born in these little villages. We visited those. I had a map of where my mother's, her father was a tailor, and they moved from house to house to house, I guess, because they had many children, many of whom died in childbirth or afterwards. So it was a family of 13 kids. And about eight of them survived, but survived to adulthood. Then my mother and only her sister survived the war. Everybody else and their families and her parents, they were all murdered. So the book actually opens with my father writing a letter to a lawyer in Sweden asking how that lawyer could help get him and a woman he just met, the woman who would become my mother, and with whom he fell in love after 2 days, how to get to the United States. So that's how the story opens. It opens with, as I like to say, with love. And and that was probably the most startling thing that I discovered, because I discovered this letter written in Yiddish, and I had to translate it. But it's a letter that is a love letter. The relationship between my mother and father that my sister and I saw was, I would not say love. I would say they needed each other. I would say it was an opportunity to start again with somebody who understood their story, because they were both survivors, so they could understand that they have nightmares and they would get sick, and that they had a history with other families and other lives, and they would understand that. So I think that's what attracted them to each other. But just seeing the word love out of my father, who was a very sweet, loving man, and then understanding that and then putting that into the context of their lives. The book is called Painful Joy because I found a poem that was written in the Middle Ages. And it was a poem written by a Jewish poet, as it turned out, and it was called Painful Joy, and it was about what happens to love when love is touched by death. And that, as soon as I saw that, I said, that has to be the title of this book, because, you know, their love, their relationship was so touched by death that it had to be a different kind of relationship altogether. And so the book begins with that, and then it ends with another story, which is about my father and the last time he used language, because he died of Alzheimer's disease. And not to give away the book, but it is touching, and it ends with love, because it basically, my mother took care of him while he had at home at a different home, near my sister in Mobile, Alabama. And so she actually showed love in a way she hadn't, I think, ever before. And then my father sees my sister, my wife and my two sons. And he had known us, but he didn't know anymore who we were. And we would visit him while he was there. I would try to see him every 2 or 3 weeks. I'd fly down there. And he looked at us just once. And he looked at us and he started crying. And he started crying, and he said in Yiddish, because he didn't speak English anymore and he barely spoke at all, he said, "I know I love you, but I don't know why." And that's how the book ends, actually, pretty much. And so it's a bookend, and the first half of the book is totally about their lives before they met each other. So it's two separate stories, one for my father, one for my mother, parallel in many ways, but different. And you can actually see where they come together as well. And then we come to the United States, and now it's a new family. It's the four of us. And that's the second half of the book, and it's almost just by chance I wrote it almost with equal parts. It's sort of odd how it happened just by writing. But the second half of the book is now, how did this family survive as a family? What happened to them in the United States, basically, from the time that we arrived in 1952 till the time they died in 93 and 98, and then looks at our lives in Brooklyn together. So mostly about our lives together, and then my sister and my life taking care of them or being affected by them in one way or another, including things that happened when we visited Sweden a second and third time, and what happened going back to where they met and where I and my sister were born.
Now, how old were your parents when they met? They met in Sweden. How old were they?
They were actually, they were in their 30s already, because they had already. My father had a wife and two little girls. He had a 4-year-old and a 1.5-year-old. So, and my mother had a husband. They hadn't started a family yet, but they married. Well, my father married in 1937, so he was 27 when he was married. My mother married when she was about 30. It was an unusually. They married relatively late in their lives. For that time, most marriages were arranged for them, and so they would, because the families are so large. I think the mother and father were trying to get rid of these kids and let somebody else take care of them. So, because they were poor people. I mean, my mother's father again was a tailor. At one point, he has 13 kids. Good luck with that. And then he ends up with 8. My father died when my father was 4 years old, suddenly. And my father was the breadwinner starting at age 12. And he started, so he has a sixth grade education, as does my mother, or did. And so it follows all these different sort of little tangents that occur to them, and you get to understand, really, in a way, how they could have survived, because in a way, they spent their young adult life in training for surviving. I think that's the only way I can explain it. A lot of luck and a lot of perseverance, a lot of never giving up, but also they had difficult lives before, and So.
Oh my God, the story.
It took a long time to answer that. I'm sorry.
No, I'm so enjoying what you're sharing. We're speaking with Max Friedman, and he's the author of Painful Joy, and he's done so much work with like Bristol Myers Squibb, the Bill Moyers Journal, WNET, and so many different forms of communication, from journalism to television to now his book, The Painful Joy, about his parents and their story, his own family story. I have to ask you, as we got about 9 minutes left in today's show, is that your parents on the book cover? They look so cool.
Yeah,
I
know. It's the coolest thing they ever did. All right. Right. The two of them are dressed up on a motorcycle. That I don't know where my father got that from. This is before they were married. So this is when they were still sort of courting, I guess you could say. But they're on the cover of Painful Joy, and if people are interested, they can see. You can go to my website, and you can see it, or you can actually put Painful Joy in and you can get it on Amazon, and it's an easy book to get that way. The cover is. I had a friend do the cover, and we found that picture of them on a motorcycle, all dressed up. This picture was taken 6 months. If you can imagine, 6 months after their liberation from one of the worst concentration camps that existed, Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was where Anne Frank died. My mother was there then, but it was a horrible, horrible place. Bodies were horrible, and the book talks about some of that. So it was 6 months before that they had just left that place, and 6 months from that picture they get married, and they get married on Christmas Day, 1946, and they get married that day because they didn't know anyone, and they wanted to have the people they worked with come to their wedding, which was not much away, but anyway, and they were working in factories in this little town called Halmstad, and so Christmas Day everybody was off, so that's how they picked Christmas Day to have a wedding.
What have readers been saying? What a story. You know, every time somebody comes on here on Off the Shelf Books, I always tell them, you can write a great book description, a great title, you can do keywords, et cetera. A lot of people would buy like a book if they knew it existed. And a lot of people don't even know of a book's out there. They might absolutely love it. This is a story, the way you're sharing what you're sharing so wonderfully here, where you just, I gotta get this book. When you listen to you, the author, talk about it, what have readers been saying about Painful Joy?
Yeah, if you go, the best way is just go to Amazon or put in Painful Joy. You go to Amazon, and you'll see there are, I don't know, about 30 reviews maybe. People wrote lots of stuff. Some stuff I'd never imagined you could see in the book, but it was well beyond me. They gave me more credit than I could ever deserve. But yeah, you could read about it, and I think most people would liked it. They were touched by it. I think they found it. I try in the book to put everything into historical context. I try, particularly on the stories of my parents, I try to explain what the world was like around the time when they were born, around the time when they were married, around the time when the Holocaust occurs, and what else is happening around that time that affects them one way or another. So I think people learn things that they might not know, things that I certainly never knew, and I thought I knew a lot just because I read a lot. But yeah, so I think people will be touched by it. People will get to know these two people. There are some reviews in there from friends who read the book, and a few of them actually knew my parents, but not mostly. And the ones who didn't had heard about my parents from me, and they found my parents to be quite multidimensional. And I think that was the point. The point was, don't just look at them as two sad people who survived a horrific time. Look at them that way, yes, because that's the truth. But also look at them as whole human beings who had all kinds of things going on in their lives before, during, and after. And that's what I want. That's the picture I wanted to paint of them.
Okay. Oh, my goodness. Now we got less than 3 minutes. Do you see yourself ever writing a novel?
Oh, my problem is that I spend so much of my life in reality and then trying to escape it in fantasy that, or not even in fantasy, just escape it, that I read mostly nonfiction. And the only fiction that I read, and therefore can, are like, stories that have happy endings one way or another, or mysteries, or, it's weird stuff. I don't see. I thought once that I would. I thought once that I would actually write a story about them, but a fictional story about them. A story about what would happen what happened to them if they still had their first families. What kind of lives would they have lived if the Holocaust hadn't happened? I still may do that. I actually wrote 10 or 12 pages of that story, and I wrote it at the very end of writing this story because it made me feel good. It made me feel like I could give them a happy ending.
How beautiful!
Yeah.
Yes.
So who knows?
Okay. Well, we'll look for it at your website. Where can Off the Shelf listeners get a copy of your book, Painful Joy?
Yeah. So just go to Amazon.com, go to BarnesandNoble.com, and there's a Kindle editions, which costs almost nothing. If people have Kindle Unlimited, it's free, actually, because you get to read almost any Kindle book for free. Otherwise, there's a hardcover edition, there's softcover edition. They're already in used bookstores. They're all over the place. You can ask a local bookseller, and they're in some libraries as well. So there are lots of places where you can go and get it.
Painful Joy. We're speaking with the author of Painful Joy, Max Friedman, and I encourage you to visit him online at maxfriedman.net, maxfriedman.net, again, maxfriedman.net. Or you can do a search for him on the search engines, Max Friedman, author of Painful Joy. What a life! Oh, my goodness. And there is no quit in Max. If you came in on the middle or end of this interview. Once it finishes streaming, you can listen to it in its entirety and share it with as many people as you like. But that was one thing that jumped out about him to me when just talking about his different writings. He just keeps going. He just keeps going forward. Some of us, a lot of us get stuck. You get laid off from a job and you get stuck. I've seen people get stuck for years when something changes. Max just keeps on going, so that's something about him I really appreciate. So encourage you again, if you came into the middle or end of the show, wait till it finishes streaming, then you can listen to it in its entirety and share with others and get a copy of Painful Joy. What a story by Max Friedman. His own life is amazing. His own life. So thank you, Max, for taking time out of your day to be here with us, and bless you and your family. Oh, my goodness. And to all of our listeners, as I always tell you, you are amazing. You are incredible. You're awesome. Go out and create a fabulous day for yourself. Max, I'll shoot you an email with the link to the interview when it finishes streaming.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. It was lovely talking to you. It was like sitting around in a living room and just talking, so it's great.
Thank you so much to our listeners. See you back here next Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Bye for now.